Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
This time into something I think, well, we've all probably dealt with it, right? Work stress.
Oh, yeah.
And not just, the normal everyday kind of stress, but that chronic, like always on stress that can really, really wear you down.
Yeah, definitely.
So today we're going to be exploring this topic through a couple of different lenses.
Okay.
First, we've got this really thought-provoking video from a YouTuber named Gel.
Yeah.
And he runs a channel called Sungran Studios, and he kind of digs into the tougher questions about life and work and things like that.
Interesting.
And then we've also got some blog posts from James. He calls himself a Canadian returnee.
Okay.
And in his blog, he really shares his experience navigating the Canadian job market.
Right.
Which sounds like it's a challenge in and of itself, dealing with some pretty tough workplaces.
Right.
And ultimately, like, how he's coping with chronic stress.
It's interesting how those two perspectives, even though they seem so different at first glance, actually do kind of touch on some of the same core challenges.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and that's kind of what we're here to dive into today. So let's start with Jill's video. His main message is pretty straightforward. Life's going to throw some curveballs at you, but the key is to just hang in there.
Yeah.
You probably heard that advice before, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost a cliche at this point, but what's interesting is that he contrasts this with the kind of drama and outrage
Right.
that we tend to see a lot online.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for just the simple reminder to just hang in there. You know, in a world that feels like it's just getting more and more complex and uncertain, I think it's easy to lose sight of that.
Yeah.
To not let the little things derail you.
For sure.
But of course, as we'll see with James's story, it's not always quite that simple.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where I think Jesus' experience gets really interesting. So he actually left a stable job overseas to come back to Canada.
Wow.
And, well, it doesn't sound like it was a super smooth homecoming. He talks about, struggling with time zone differences while he was trying to find a job, getting ghosted by recruiters and just facing a ton of competition. It's almost ironic, isn't it?
Yep.
He leaves this secure job to go back home, and it's anything but easy.
Yeah, that's tough. And you also have to consider the kind of the larger context here. James mentions Canada's C-11 and C-18 bills.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, these have been pretty controversial.
I've heard these.
Yeah, they essentially restrict media access, and they've had some, I guess you could say, unintended consequences for people who work remotely.
Especially people outside of Canada.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So for those of us who aren't super familiar with Canadian law, can you kind of break that down for us? Like, how could these bills have actually impacted someone like James who's trying to find a job?
Well, imagine you're a Canadian living abroad and you're looking for remote work back in Canada, right?
Sure.
You know, before these bills, you could pretty easily go on Canadian news websites, check job boards,
Yep.
even join social media groups to network and find different opportunities. But now, with these restrictions in place, it's much harder. It's like trying to find your way around a city that you thought you knew, but suddenly all the street signs are gone.
Wow. So it's not even just about the competition in the job market itself.
Right.
There are all these additional obstacles.
Exactly.
Wow. And speaking of obstacles, James ends up landing this job at what seems like an amazing crypto company.
Okay.
He was really drawn to their values, environmentally conscious, low overhead.
Right.
He negotiated to be able to work remotely,
Smart.
got a higher salary. It sounds like, kind of the perfect fit on paper, right?
Yeah, it's interesting how, even in a field like crypto that can be so volatile, finding a company whose values align with your own can be just so compelling.
Yeah.
And he really did his homework, He found a manager who he seemed to really get along with. It seemed like he'd found, the perfect opportunity.
Yeah, totally. But then the company decides to pivot to the metaverse.
Uh-oh.
And in James's words, he describes it as basically Second Life with blockchain.
Oh, wow.
And that's when things start to kind of fall apart.
Yeah.
Cash flow problems, layoffs.
Oh, no.
It makes you think, how much risk are you willing to take on in your own career, especially when things are so uncertain? Are there any red flags, from your perspective that you've kind of learned to watch out for?
Well, it's a classic case of what can happen when hype just gets way ahead of reality.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's not even the end of James's story. He eventually finds another position at this company that prides itself on being non-toxic, which, as you can probably guess, turns out to be quite the opposite.
Oh, no. And this is where his story, I think, gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
Because he starts talking about, the red flags that he missed along the way.
Right.
And it all starts with how the company treated one of his colleagues. And it's almost like, this colleague's experience is kind of a foreshadowing of what James himself is going to go through.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this colleague is like super enthusiastic, ready to jump in and contribute. But she runs into all these technical difficulties right from the start.
Oh, no.
During onboarding. And she's not getting the support that she needs.
Wow.
And then tragically, she has a death in the family.
Oh.
And instead of the company being compassionate and understanding,
Right.
they actually end up penalizing her for it.
Oh, that's awful.
It's really heartbreaking. And it speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the company culture?
Yeah, it really does make you think about how these toxic workplaces, they often have these like patterns of behavior, these subtle signs that something's not quite right.
Totally. And I think that's a great point because it can be really hard to spot those red flags sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially when you're, excited about a new opportunity.
Right.
So what are some of the key takeaways here? Like, what can we as listeners learn from James's experience so that we can protect ourselves?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's a reminder that toxic workplaces can be really good at hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
Especially, like you said, when you're first starting out,
right?
You're excited about the job, you want to make a good impression.
Totally.
So you might overlook some of those early warning signs. So it's crucial to pay attention, to be vigilant, and look out for those red flags.
So, like, what are some specific red flags that people should be looking for?
Well, is there a lack of trust? Like, do you feel like people aren't being straight with you? Is there a lack of transparency?
Yeah.
Is communication kind of one-sided or just really poor overall? Does there seem to be a lot of favoritism going on or blame shifting? Those are all pretty big signs that something might be off.
I think that's a great point. And one thing that James talks about is learning this really valuable, although painful, lesson, which is that your coworkers are not your friends.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a tough one to swallow, I think, especially when you're new to a company.
Right.
You're trying to build relationships.
Exactly.
But it's so important to have those boundaries.
It is, and I think it's important to clarify that that doesn't mean you can't have genuine friendships with colleagues.
Right.
Of course you can.
Of course.
But it's about having those healthy boundaries, especially in a toxic environment. It's about protecting yourself from potential, manipulation or drama that can happen when those lines get blurred.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that all of us can relate to, especially those of us who maybe have started a new job recently or just dealing with some tricky workplace dynamics.
For sure.
So we've talked about recognizing those red flags and setting those boundaries. But what happens when you're already in a situation that feels toxic?
Right.
Like, what are some things that we can do?
Well, James really emphasizes the importance of self-advocacy.
So that means speaking up for yourself, addressing those issues head on with your manager or with HR.
Yeah.
Documenting everything that's happening.
Right.
And seeking support from people that you trust.
Yeah.
Outside of the company.
So having that kind of like network outside of work.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's so important.
But he also acknowledges that there's a point where self-advocacy might not be enough.
Right.
And sometimes the healthiest choice you can make is to just walk away.
Yeah.
To prioritize your own well-being, even if it means,
taking the financial hit or starting over.
Exactly.
And that's a really tough decision to make.
It is.
But it's so important to have that support system in place, right? Like
absolutely.
Friends, family, mentors, even online communities, like people who can offer a different perspective and offer encouragement.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that you don't have to go through this alone.
For sure.
And sometimes just having someone to talk to who gets it, who understands, can make all the difference in the world.
Absolutely. But let's be real, walking away from a job, especially when you factor in financial stress and job security and all those anxieties.
Yeah.
It's not always easy, is it?
No, not at all.
And this is where James's story takes, I think, a really important turn towards something that a lot of us struggle with, chronic stress.
Yeah.
He really goes into detail about the toll that it took on him, both physically and emotionally.
And it's important to remember that chronic stress isn't just about having a bad day or feeling a little overwhelmed. It's really a prolonged state of like
Yeah.
physiological and psychological arousal.
Wow.
And that can have some pretty serious consequences for your health.
So it's not just in our heads.
It's not just in your head, no.
It's like a physical thing.
It's a real physical response.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. Imagine your body's stress response system is kind of like a car alarm.
Right. If it goes off every now and then, it's annoying, sure, but it's not a huge deal.
Right.
But if that car alarm is going off constantly, 24/7,
Yeah.
it's going to drain the battery, it's going to wear down the engine,
Right.
and eventually something is going to break down.
Wow, that's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
I like that. And it really makes you understand why chronic stress can manifest in so many different ways.
Exactly.
James even talks about things like having hives and eczema,
Wow.
memory problems.
Yeah.
It's almost like his body is screaming at him,
Yeah.
trying to tell him something's wrong.
Exactly. And a lot of times those physical symptoms, those are just the tip of the iceberg. You know, chronic stress can lead to anxiety and depression,
Yeah.
insomnia, problems with digestion,
Wow.
even a weakened immune system.
Oh,
It's like a
yeah.
domino effect.
Yeah.
It can impact every area of your life.
So how do we even recognize the signs of chronic stress, like in ourselves?
Yeah.
What should we be paying attention to?
Well, it can be tough to spot. Especially in a culture that's constantly telling us to be busy and productive. We're always on the go.
Right.
But, if you think about it,
Yeah.
if you were driving your car and the check engine light came on,
Yeah.
would you just ignore it and keep driving?
Probably not.
No, probably not, right? You'd probably take it to a mechanic, figure out what's going on, get it fixed.
Right.
Our bodies kind of do the same thing,
Yeah.
They send us these warning signals, but we often just ignore them or try to push through.
It's like we've normalized it,
Yeah, I think we have.
almost to the point where we don't even recognize it anymore.
Exactly.
And it kind of makes me think back to Jell's message about hanging in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great message, don't get me wrong. But I think, as we've seen with James's story,
Yeah.
sometimes hanging in there without a plan can actually make things worse.
It definitely can.
You
You're absolutely right. Hanging in there can be really powerful
Yeah.
when it comes from a place of self-awareness. Right.
And when you're actually taking steps to address the problem,
Mm-hmm.
but it becomes a problem when it's keeping you stuck
Right.
in a situation that's harming you.
Totally.
James, at first, he tried to deal with the stress by, spending time with his family, playing games.
Yeah, finding those healthy outlets.
Exactly. But those strategies, they only work for so long.
Right.
Especially when the source of the stress, in this case, that toxic work environment, isn't changing.
It's still there.
It's still there, exactly.
And it's tough to read about his breaking point.
Yeah.
He gets this negative performance review where it just feels like all of his efforts are completely dismissed. And his manager shows no empathy whatsoever.
Wow.
Just like adding insult to injury.
It really highlights how important the role of a manager is
Oh, yeah.
in terms of either reducing or making workplace stress worse.
Yeah,
A good manager can be such a source of support,
for sure.
Guidance, encouragement.
But a manager who's dismissive
Yeah.
or just doesn't seem to care at all
Right.
can make a tough situation so much harder.
I think that's a great point, and it's something that we should all keep in mind as we're looking for jobs.
Absolutely.
Not just focusing on the company itself, but the people that we'd be working with.
Exactly.
And, it brings us back to that idea of self-care,
Mm-hmm.
which I think when you're in the middle of all this chronic stress,
Right.
it can feel impossible.
It can.
But as you said earlier, it's not a luxury.
It's not. No, it's essential.
It's a necessity.
And it's not just about, bubble baths and face masks,
Right.
although those can be nice.
Yeah, for sure.
It's really about figuring out what helps you to recharge, what helps you to de-stress.
Yeah.
For some people, it might be exercise,
Right.
spending time in nature, listening to music,
Mm-hmm.
connecting with loved ones. For others, it might be things like therapy, meditation, journaling.
So it's really personal.
It's very personal. Yeah.
It's about finding what works for you.
And what helps you manage those emotions and build that resilience.
Exactly.
And, like James found out, it can also be about finding those support groups.
Yes.
Those communities where you can connect with people who really understand.
Yeah, it's a reminder that you don't have to go through this alone.
Totally.
There are resources out there, people who care,
Yeah.
and strategies that can help.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the most powerful form of self-care
Yeah.
is setting those boundaries,
Yes.
knowing your worth, and just refusing to stay in a work environment
Right.
that compromises your well-being.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into work stress, it feels like we've really gone beyond that simple message of hanging in there.
I think we have.
And we've really explored what it means to navigate work stress
Yeah.
in a way that puts our well-being first.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that resilience isn't just about toughing it out.
It's about knowing when to push forward,
Right.
when to ask for help, and when to walk away.
And I think ultimately it's about equipping ourselves with the tools or the resources that we need to actually thrive,
Yes.
both personally and professionally.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So I want to leave you with this one thought.
Okay.
As you go back to your own work life, what are your non-negotiables? When it comes to your well-being,
That's a great question.
what boundaries do you need to set? What steps can you take starting today to create a work environment that truly supports your mental, emotional, and physical health?
Love it.
And remember, hanging in there is about resilience, not just endurance, no matter the cost.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time, take care.